Jessie Benton Fremont could have never imagined all the adventures that life would bring her.
It was love at first sight. I was just 15 when Father introduced me to his protege, John C. Fremont. He was 27, a handsome Army officer who had already explored the West. If I had known then what our life together would bring, would I still have married so young, against the will of my parents? I'm Jessie Benton Fremont, born in 1824, daughter of Elizabeth McDowell Benton and the powerful Senator Thomas Hart Benton. Father taught me history, politics, and government from childhood. One of my earliest memories is sitting quietly in the White House listening to Father talk with President Andrew Jackson. I was unaware that bird watching with John James Audubon or discussing Manifest Destiny with senators was unusual for a young girl. Father insisted I read the classics in their original language, so at the age of 12, I could speak and read 5 languages fluently, including Greek and Latin. Little did I know I was being prepared for my future. After John and I had been introduced, anyone could see we only had eyes for each other. My parents were alarmed. Father used his influence to have John sent off on another expedition immediately. I was inconsolable the 14 months he was gone. When he returned, we married in secret. But John was part of the Army Topographical Corps. He was often away exploring. In fact, he was gone 5 of our first 8 years of marriage, and I could never be certain whether he was dead or alive. Upon his return, Congress expected him to write detailed reports of his discoveries. I picked up piles of crumpled paper and watched him pace restlessly for days. Then I intervened. John, why don't we work on this together? Tell me about your expedition and I will do the writing. The work took months, but capturing the wonders of John's exploration not only brought us closer together, it helped me imagine places I never got to see. Finally, we submitted the 215-page report to Congress. It was an immediate sensation. The public clamored for copies, and thousands were printed for sale. The adventures inspired Longfellow in writing his epic poem, Evangeline. The report became a book carried by emigrants heading west. Manifest Destiny, the dream of conquering this continent, was coming true. One day in 1845, when I was home alone, Secretary of State James Buchanan came calling. Jessie, I need your help. The United States wants to take over California, so I need to gauge the mood of Mexico. I know you're fluent in Spanish, so I want you to translate these newspapers and documents from Mexico for me. I fear there's a spy in Washington, and I don't trust the reports I've been getting. But remember, not a word of this to your husband or to your father, the senator. I set to work at once. I'd love to tell you what I learned, but it was a secret mission. A few years later, I was to accompany John to California with our 2 young children. We got as far as St. Louis when suddenly our 10-week-old baby son died in the night. What could we do? John had to continue on with his men, while I returned east with 6-year-old Lily. After I felt stronger, and against the advice of everyone, I boarded a ship in New York with my daughter, my lady's maid, and 350 men. We sailed south to Panama, then made the arduous crossing of the isthmus by mule, dugout canoe, and on foot. One night I stayed in a rickety house on stilts, barely fit for human habitation, and I was served baked monkey. After finally reuniting with John in San Francisco, we settled into 2 rented rooms in the dusty Mexican village of Monterey. There we had a lovely view of the ocean, but no furniture, and no food except whatever we could hunt or gather. And John was off again for weeks without a word, to the mines this time. Fortunately, my command of Spanish endeared me to the local women who took us under their wing. Then one night, John suddenly burst in and laid a large sack at my feet. "Open it, my darling." Inside, I found gold, 100 pounds of it. He raced out and brought in another sack and another. 300 pounds of gold. We were rich. I was now 24 years old. In 1855, we traveled back through the Isthmus to New York, then set sail for London. John was honored by the Royal Geographic Society, and I was presented to Queen Victoria in a lovely pink satin and lace gown. Then on to Paris, where I enjoyed unimaginable luxury. What a contrast to California, where we'd barely had food. We returned to Washington when John was chosen the first presidential candidate of the brand new Republican Party. I welcomed visitors, hosted receptions, wrote John's campaign speeches, and published his biography. No woman had ever been so involved in a presidential campaign before. Soon the crowds were chanting "Fremont and Jessie for president" and singing songs about me like "Jessie shall be our liberty's queen." Only we lost the election to our old friend James Buchanan. Voters feared our anti-slavery stance would lead to civil war. How ironic, the nation would soon be at war anyway. We returned to California. I had our mountain cabin whitewashed and said I lived in the White House. By 1873, John had lost our entire fortune through bad railroad investments. We were desperate for money. I convinced a New York newspaper editor to pay me for a weekly column, "Distinguished Persons I Have Known." Readers devoured my reminiscences of Martin Van Buren, Kit Carson, Hans Christian Andersen. Soon I was paid for a series of stories about my childhood and my first journey to California. Another editor agreed to pay me $100 per story I would write of our adventures in the West. I holed myself up in the bedroom and wrote 16 stories. In less than 2 weeks, our lives had been filled with adventure. In my book, Far West Sketches, I told tales of grizzly bears and giant sequoia trees, of the dramatic mountains and valleys of Yosemite. Looking back, knowing what I know now, would I still choose to marry the explorer John C. Fremont? Oh yes, we traveled the most interesting places and met so many wonderful people. And despite everything, our love story has lasted 50 years. I wouldn't have missed it.